it's how do these two Democrat Republicans, handle the diverse point of view that they had coming into office. So if you think about it, John Adams and George Washington both interpret the Constitution similarly, as did John Marshall, which is, we use it for a strong centralized government for authority to deal with problems, particularly in the foreign arena, right? But by and large, they're fairly similar in their outlook. Both, I think Washington and Adams, certainly Hamilton and Marshall, kind of viewed society as tumultuous, kind of what we're talking about just now, as ugly and capable of ugly things. Jefferson thinks that people have potential for greatness, and the reality is that the Constitution should not limit that, which is what we fought a revolution for, is to not have our rights limited, so to speak. That's what he believes. So when they come in, the DRs, which were called historically the Friends of Jefferson, are strict in their interpretation. That's the language you need to know, all right? Now, they're not going to use the word originalist yet, because the Constitution's still hanging out like fresh, the ink's still drying on it, all right? But they strictly are trying to interpret it. That's their belief. There's a Frenchman who came up with a term during Jefferson's presidency. His name was Touart, and he said that there was a word that he created called ideology, which is a system of beliefs. That word didn't exist prior, So when he created the word ideology, that kind of is what this is. So it's a belief system. Now, not religious belief, but nonetheless, when I read the Constitution, this is what I believe, so to speak. So that which is not permitted, Article 1, Section 8, is denied. So this is a strict interpretation. Meaning, who can do it instead, theoretically? The states. The states. So talking about Judge Barrett, there's a lot of, and by the way, I don't give nearly as much sound and fury to Republican appointees becoming overtly conservative on the bench. Does anybody know what judge broke the tie on the gay marriage vote? Donald Trump's appointment, Neil Gorsuch, all right? So you hear this language of, it's a conservative or a liberal. Well, that's probably true to some degree, but I believe, if they're qualified, and again, this judge is certainly qualified, the now Justice Barrett, then that's the point. That's how you interpret the Constitution is open to interpretation. You understand? There is no single right way to interpret it. So, people believe that this strict interpretation, now they call this originalism. Like, if it ain't in there, then you don't get it, so to speak. Now, obviously, that's not to say that there are powers that have been expanded to deal with modern times. When it says in the Congress, Article 1, that it could promote the arts and sciences, can NASA be promoting the sciences? Yeah, of course they're not going to put space exploration, and that's wherein lies the debate about how much power is there, right? 10th Amendment is where they find their home, the reserved powers, So I expect to see words like strict, expressed, reserved, and then what their views were on specific stuff. So when you think about Hamilton's program, very loose in its interpretation of the Constitution. Very loose, right? So assumption, that's loose. Nor the Constitution to say you can take on the debts of the states. The bus was loose. A specific tax on whiskey, right? And, well, they can pass taxes and they can pass tariffs. That's totally in the Constitution. But did the DRs like these taxes? That's right. Keep in mind, Southerners are going to routinely oppose tariffs. You know why?
They do a lot of exports.
Tariffs don't affect exports. It's against the law to tax exports. That's in the Constitution.
Well, they import all the manufacturing.
There we go. Now, Southerners have to buy all their stuff from somewhere else because they don't have any what down south? Any factories. Now, theoretically, then the tariff means they're going to buy their stuff not from Europe, but from where?
No.
Massachusetts or Rhode Island, right? But at the same time, what does a tariff then do to the good? I usually just show this as soon as you guys online can't see this. Sure. So if like if you're making boots, all right, you're a brand new boot maker, Blake's Boots, all right, here in America. So you got to get leather, you got to get wood, you got to get nails, you got to have steel. So your cobbler, you know, the Blake's boots are going to be, let's say $2 a boot. Okay. But Britain's boots already exist and have been making boots for decades, right? And so they can ship those boots over here for $1.50. So which boot are you going to buy?
Probably the one from Britain.
Yeah, all things being equal, you're going to buy the one that's 50 cents cheaper, right?
Yep. But then the tariff in place is
Slap a 40% tariff on it.
and it's higher than buying local.
But if you're the southern consumer of boots, where before your cheapest boot was $1.50, now your cheapest boot is $2.10. So you see, from a southern perspective, tariffs suck. All right. Northern perspective, hey, these are good for business. You know? So that's a sectional issue that's going to emerge. You will hear people, apologists for the Confederacy, say the Civil War fought over tariffs. All right. So that will happen. People will talk like that. All right. Very much opposed to a strong centralized government in general. That doesn't mean they're not going to like disrupt the Constitution outright, but nonetheless, it is often confusing for students that Madison is a key member of the DRs, yet he was an author of the what? Federalist Papers. Now, the easy answer, which is not correct, would be to say that when Jefferson returned from France, he like scolded Madison for being a Federalist, and Madison got back in line. The reality is that Madison's point of view changed. While he did expect a stronger centralized government than what existed, he did not expect what Hamilton created. So it's like he thought they went too far the other way. But he was his own man. He wasn't just a echo for Thomas Jefferson. All right. They opposite, loose. Hamilton's loose interpretation. If it's not denied, then it's permitted. It's not permitted, it's denied. Remember? That's this group. So if I'm a DR, it's not in there, you can't do it. Federalist, if it's not denied, then I can do it. All right. And there are parts of the Constitution which deny. Article 1, Section 9 says powers not granted to Congress. Powers denied. You can't make ex post facto laws. You can't grant titles of nobility. All right. And for them, the key to their beliefs, at least at this time in history, is the elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause. So elastic clause and necessary proper clause versus 10th Amendment and reserved powers. Neither is correct, I don't think. Neither is wrong. They're both correct. All right. It literally depends on how you interpret government. So we, by the way, are at a period in American history where very loose in interpretation. So when we talk about the conservative revolution of Ronald Reagan, sometimes called the devolution revolution, he's been, since the 80s, America slowly shifted back toward the more, well, not slowly necessarily, but a lot more conservatism than since FDR and Lyndon Johnson. So it's a pendulum. You had two really famous presidents who did a whole lot of stuff loosely. All right. And so that led to a more, let's limit the role of government attitude. So even with people like Clinton and Obama, not nearly as liberal as somebody from the 1920s and 30s. So we're sort of, they're left of center, but not far left of center. Someone like Bernie Sanders would go take you all the way back to FDR. Way swing back. You understand? There's a big difference between Sanders and Biden, though. I can assure you that, as do many of the supporters know. Okay, so they are conservative by nature. The Federalists are America's conservative party. I would know that too. Like, if you were a conservative in America, you were probably a Federalist. If you were more liberal, you were probably a DR. Now, keep in mind, this is classic liberal, not modern liberal, where that means using the government to effect more equality. You understand the difference? There is no social safety net under Thomas Jefferson. There's no welfare. There's no unemployment insurance. There's no minimum wage laws. None of that stuff exists at all. And it won't exist for a very long time. So it's really comparing, that's like comparing modern presidents to these guys. These guys probably did less work in a year than some of our presidents did in a week, in terms of actual work. So yeah, it's a really different period in history. All right. Now, I've already told you about Jefferson, and you're going to have to examine his presidency, but if you didn't get these notes already, be sure to make sure you know them. By having a spirit of bipartisanship, is that consistent with any ideology? Is this either strict or loose? Is this any sort of constitutional argument at all? No, but the good side, it's bipartisan. That's what both of these things are. They're bipartisan. That means both sides are like sort of reflected here. There are some issues that we don't have to be partisan on. You understand? I was really hoping the pandemic would be one of those things where it's like, we will all want to win against the pandemic, right? It should not be a political thing. Wear your mask, stop the plague, right? Like,
sure enough, they just
somehow it became a symbol of freedom to, you know, pass a disease to other people.
yeah.
All right, potentially. So the point is that war historically is nonpartisan. Like, people try to come together and support the country, unless they fundamentally oppose the reason for it. So here he's saying, I'm not going to fire all of my employees that are Federalists. They're just going to stay in office. You know? That ticked off the DRs, but partisanship is not in the Constitution, so he doesn't have to interpret it constitutionally. Make sense? You don't have to worry about, gee, am I supposed to do this? You know, it can actually be. By the way, is Thomas Jefferson an experienced politician? Yeah, absolutely. We forget this by this phase. This man has been in office, elected office, for quite a while. Okay, he's been vice president. He's been governor of Virginia, secretary of state, and then of course he's had numerous appointments. He's been a delegate to the Virginia House of Burgesses. So this guy knows politics. All right, as much as he doesn't act, he kind of like floats above the fray. You know, he's philosophical chief, but he knows. So this is a choice. And then we went over these yesterday, so I don't want to spend all day doing this again. We've already covered it. Here, is this anything about the Constitution here? This is where it gets interesting. This is completely consistent with his authority to get Congress to create a new naturalization law. He is partisan here to a degree because who are immigrants to him? That's right. They tend to vote Democrat, Republican. But at the same time, most people would argue a 14-year citizenship naturalization process is too long. Like that's prohibitively long, right? What, 7 now? I forget. You know, depends, of course, backlog on, but I'll have to double check. But you know, in other words, this was consistent with his party, but he doesn't go and then punish the Federalists. So not overtly partisan there, right? He only gets rid of what? The whiskey tax. Now, he didn't get rid of these, but expired. The whiskey tax is the only part of Hamilton's program, which means he could go after the bus. I know I told you that who does go after the bus in the future, our 7th president. Andrew Jackson will kill the Bank of the United States, another Democrat small government guy. He'll destroy it. All right. But he didn't do that. And he doesn't say, hey, that assumption thing's got to stop. We're sending the debt back to the states, does he? So he doesn't dismantle a program that he was highly critical of when he was in office, right? And I've said before, if I were rating President Trump's campaign promises versus reality, the big failure is Obamacare. I mean, he super duper campaigned on getting rid of it. He had the votes. And when his folks proposed a bill, he said, oh, it's too mean, which gave more moderate senators in the Republican caucus a chance to vote it down, as well as John McCain thinks. Right? You know, but my point is like that was a signature thing. So what did Jefferson's supporters kind of think he was going to do here? Yeah, get rid of Hamilton's stuff. Now, he did sort of get rid of Hamilton's stuff out. You pay down the national debt. But at the same time, you know, that was exactly what Hamilton hoped would happen. Would give us good credit. We borrowed money and then we paid it off. So, and then we go to that Embargo Act. Boy, well, we'll get to there. Now, the Tripolitan War to me is not unconstitutional as the President Commander-in-Chief.
Yes.
But is it sort of contrary to what Jefferson has stated about his views on warfare? Well, but what did we say yesterday about are there some people you can't negotiate with? Pirates are not the kind of people that you're like, hey, we're not trading with you. You're not trading with me now. I'm taking your stuff. All right, you know. So this would be like, I'm not giving you my lunch money, bully. The bully's like, that's okay, I'll take it. You know, so he feels like we either fight back or impotent, right, without power. And I put this in bold because what conundrum does it create for Jefferson? What part of it could be unconstitutional? I mean, why is he concerned? How much had he been authorized to spend?
10 million.
Does the president have any control over how much money they can get from Congress, single-handedly? Is the president supposed to spend money that Congress doesn't allocate? No, the Congress is the pocketbook. The Congress is the checkbook, right? So he is going to spend money that who didn't give him? Congress, and he was given permission to buy where? What was the law passed to allocate this money?
The little territory.
Well, Louisiana's New Orleans and land to the east. If he comes back with New Orleans, a giant swath of land, half America. So does he go beyond what he's been authorized to do?
Yes.
Does he do it because it's what's needed?
Yes.
Flexibility, right? So it shows he's flexible. What's interesting is look at what the Federalists do. Now, why would the Federalists vote against it? Well, we know for selfish reasons. What are the selfish reasons they vote? Yeah, what are the political reasons?
They don't want to have one.
Maybe. I don't think it really is much more complex than simply they don't want Jefferson out of the win. Although I'm sure that's true. So who are factory workers? These new factory workers, where are they? They're in New England, right? When the cities get overcrowded, what does that do to their labor pool? Right? Labor pool increases, what happened to wages?
They go up. Down.
Yeah, supply and demand, right? Don't they want lots of people? And what are lots of people now going to do? And when they go west, what kind of voting are they going to do? There's your political answer. They're going to go DR, right? Western settlers are DRs, right? So they want these workers to stay in the east, bottled up in their cities, Boston, Providence, stuff like that, to keep labor cheap. You understand? And the more land you add, the more easy it is to leave those eastern cities. Because land will be virtually free, right? Plus, they're going to vote for DRs. Now, the Federalists oppose it because they claim it's unconstitutional because it's a loose interpretation. Why is that ironic? Because they are okay with loose. And this goes back to principles versus expediency, right? They're not really principled governmental people any more than the other side is. It's like whatever argument works best when I'm governing. Well, there you go. Isn't it the reality of life? It says one thing. I mean, if Jefferson were diehard serious about this, it really. So when I tell people, guys, the Civil War is not fought over states' rights. A kid was running out in the middle of a field saying, I'm doing this for states' rights. Right? You realize, of course, that New England was in the midst of nullifying federal laws under their state right. They were fighting over their own right, you understand, to do something. It's just like the Puritans. They didn't come here for the principle of religious freedom. They came here for what? Their own religious freedom. Do you see the difference? So freedom of speech is a principle, right? Me having freedom of speech and you not is expedient. All right? That's not a principle. You understand? So it's real easy to argue you feel a principle stand also do. That's cool, I dig it. But then when you're like, oh, well, now that principle doesn't work to my advantage, I no longer principle. Well, that makes you like most people. Okay? It's just like integrity. It's just like service. There's a reason why, by the way, the Bible tells you to pray in the dark. You know why? You're not showing off. Right? Because all of this is about yourself at the end of the day. We get that, right? It's whatever benefits me in this moment, not what principle stand there is. So I just want to make sure you understand that, all right? However, I do think they develop principles out of experience. Impeaching Chase is a terrible precedent. Why? And this by the way, is McConnell. Next time Republicans have a nominee and the Dems are in control of the Senate, guess what they're going to do? Yeah, they're going to let them have it. They're not going to let them have it. And so you unleash precedents like this, and people are like, well, if you did this, you didn't follow your word, so you can't trust them, right? Well, why was this a good lesson for them? What should we not do, DR said? We should not impeach justices simply because we don't like them. Because that will create a very bad precedent, right? Like, in other words, that would make the judicial branch completely politicized. All right, and that would not be necessarily helpful. Okay. Another Chesapeake, did it work? Didn't work. All right, the way we responded. Boycott. We're not going to shop, not going to shop with you, British. All right, then he said, okay, embargo. Now I do remind you who passed this. So when we're talking about these presidents, think of them as leaders of parties. But in reality, it's the Congress that passes these bills. I haven't talked much about Congress. And so that leads us to James Madison. Okay? So we'll look at Madison today with some specific stuff, and then we'll come back to these couple of lines. We're not going to fight the War of 1812 today, but we will get through Madison a little bit and then do some review. So let's go to the election of 1808. Now, you may recall that Jefferson left office in what he called a splendid misery. He hated it at that point. He had been unpopular to a degree in New England. And what you see here, and I don't have the election of 1804 in front of me, but you actually see some gains for the Federalists in this election. They actually get more votes than they did last time, and that's because of particularly the part of the country that's coastal. Look at the coastal region, right? Why would the coastal regions really support the Federalists? By the way, this is Thomas Pinckney of the most powerful South Carolina family, the Pinckneys. We've had Charles Pinckney and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. So the Pinckney, you guys remember Pinckney's Treaty? Yep. There's a reason why, where was Pinckney's Treaty with? Spain, right? And so here you had the South Carolinian senator, going over there. So the Pinckney is a very famous name. You probably remember those guys who watched the John Adams video. At one point, John Adams is the president of the Senate, and he's, Mr. Pinckney, you will cease. So there are lots of Pinckneys, signers of the Constitution. So he's going to be run as Federalist. And you can see he actually pretty much overwhelmingly wins where? New England. He wins Delaware, parts of Maryland, and parts of North Carolina. He doesn't interestingly win any of South Carolina, but he does. So he does okay. But Madison wins comfortably. You can see up here 70% of the electoral vote. So he was Jefferson's. Now keep in mind, Madison was never going to be a very good president. And the reason I say that is he had zero executive experience. Okay, now he's been in important positions in Jefferson, Secretary of State. But in all honesty, little Jimmy was the kind of guy who did not want to be seen. His voice was soft. He was 5'2". He weighed 100 pounds. So they called him Little Jimmy. Little Jimmy. All right. Now, his one asset that was going to help overwhelm that was his wife. Dolly was a terrific first lady. Now, keep in mind, the White House hadn't had a first lady yet officially. Abigail Adams lived in it while it was still being built. Thomas Jefferson's wife is dead, so his niece was the lady of the mansion. They didn't call it the White House back then, by the way. It wasn't white. The executive mansion, they called it, right? So Dolly was gregarious and vivacious and funny and pretty, and so she was everything that little Jimmy wasn't. Little Jimmy was the kind of guy who would have been a small little kind of egghead kid, but he goes to Princeton and he's brilliant. So he makes up for his little body with a great mind. So to speak. But he was never an executive. This guy was not a governor or anything like that. So he's going to face some real issues, okay? This is what the Non-Intercourse Act was. It was passed in the last months of Jefferson's presidency, okay? And it didn't work. But by the way, both the embargo and the Non-Intercourse Act were Madison's ideas. He was the Secretary of State, all right, with Jefferson. And so finally they passed, the first bill fails, but in 1810, they passed the second bill called Macon's Bill, named after its sponsor. So this is Macon's Bill number 2. And in Macon's Bill number 2, the agreement is we will trade with any country that tells we'll stop harassing us. And so Napoleon says, okay, we'll do it. Now, we've already talked about all of this had laid the foundation for America's Industrial Revolution. America's Industrial Revolution is going to start about 1790. This is why Hamilton perceives the need for a tariff, among other things. And so the irony of all these protectionist acts is that if we're protecting against foreign, we have to have domestic. So, you know, domestic manufacture of clothing, particularly clothing, that's the most important at that time in history, is going to take off. Okay, domestic of clothing. Now, I've already talked to you about what impressment was, right? And that's what motivated Jefferson and Madison to just stop altogether. I think they grossly underestimated how unpopular this would be. Well, honestly, that's not what they grossly underestimated how long Britain would be willing to do what Britain did. Britain did not change. They didn't stop being Britain. They didn't change their policy towards us. So that really made Jefferson and Madison in a kind of a tough bind, because they were hoping to coerce Britain into leaving us alone, and that wasn't working, or that didn't work. Meanwhile, while that's going on in the high seas, this is going on. This is Tecumseh, and he is a Shawnee, Native American, who has created one of those effectively periodic confederacies, you know, where he gets a group of tribes to join together. And they are being armed by who? And they are in Indiana. Okay? They're in what is today Indiana. And so keep in mind, they're in the territory that is the Northwest Territory. And Britain is still in the territory in Michigan, right? So they haven't abandoned their forts. James Treaty, they said they would, they didn't. You know, so they're still hanging out, still arming. And this is outraging frontiersmen, because who's having to fight with them mostly? The guys building log cabins, right? You know, they're having to fight with the Shawnee. And so we have the governor of Indiana. Keep in mind, when there's a territory, you have a circuit court system and a governor. And so this is the territorial governor of Indiana, and his name is William Henry Harrison. Okay, William Henry Harrison. And he brings the group that the Shawnee have created, the Confederation, and they sign an agreement. But Tecumseh doesn't. Tecumseh, and this is similar to what happens with the Sioux later. There will be some chiefs who do not accept, well, surrender, basically, treaty. And so his confederacy are made up of men, often from the same tribes, who did not agree to this. Like, they feel like the guys that did this sold them out. You understand? So with that, they start trying to attack whites who settle in Indiana, western or eastern Illinois, southern Michigan. And Tecumseh, he's the leader of this group, and his brother is the other like chieftain. His name is the Prophet. He's the spirit guide of the tribe. So Tecumseh and the Prophet are leading the Shawnee in Indiana against American settlers. And so William Henry Harrison forms a militia unit, an army. So he'll be General William Henry Harrison, and he will attack and fight both the Prophet and ultimately defeat Tecumseh. All right? And the battle I want you to learn from this, so Tecumseh's brother is the Prophet. The Prophet will lose at Tippecanoe. That's a place in Indiana. All right, Tippecanoe. I don't have it. I don't think in this map, but it's like up here. Okay. So there is later on, General Harrison will be elected president of the United States, and his campaign slogan that his people use is Tippecanoe, and that's John Tyler too. All right, so Tippecanoe and Tyler too come from this experience. So Harrison defeats the Tecumseh and the Prophet. He beats Tecumseh at a battle called the Thames. It's spelled like Thames River in England, but Thames, Thames. So he wins both of these battles. But you'll notice he's fighting in what, keep in mind, this continues on. So he's fighting into what year? 1812. So who was arming Tecumseh? And who's still in Michigan? Yeah, right up the road. All right, now, there are also going to be other frontier types, Southerners as well, who believed that the time has come to punish the British. The British were harassing our ships, remember, impressing our seamen. They were arming these Indians on the frontier. They hadn't abandoned their posts. They were violating Jay's Treaty and the Treaty of Paris. And so you had a group of congressmen and senators who began advocating for war. Now, one thing that's important to note is this generation has not had a war. Keep in mind, this is the first post-revolutionary era adults, right? Like their daddies fought in the revolution. They hadn't had a war. So they won a war. And so they become known as what? Hawks, war hawks. Now, a hawk is a bird of prey, right? So if you're pro-military intervention, pro-warfare, you're called hawkish. The counterpoint to that, if you're for like Jefferson, if you're not in favor of military activity or warfare, you're called dovish. So you're hawks and doves. Got it? Dove, symbol, peace. So these are the war hawks. Henry Clay, very, very famous name. You're going to learn that a lot more often. John C. Calhoun, you'll learn him a lot more. Other guys like Felix Grundy. So these are men in Congress saying we should do what? Go to war with, for what reason?
For the
Indians?
investigation, for impressment.
Yeah.
And for refusal.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Get out of our country. Right. So our national pride, right? Demand. So in the midst of that, we're going to have another election, and I'll give you a few more things. And here you have a New Yorker. He's a Federalist. His name is Clinton, and he is easily defeated again by who gets reelected easily. But at the time, if you were looking at the sort of constituency of the American public, the voters, you can see that where are they mostly, the DRs, where are they mostly based? The South and West. And New York will be a great swing state, but here you can see the North pretty much it's not enough to win victory for President Madison. Which that election year, of what year? Keep in mind, the DRs are your war hawks who do not want a war with Britain. The Federalists. The Federalists do not want a war. No, keep in mind, they're the ones who want to trade with the British. Right. You understand? Napoleon is still in office. He'll be there 2 more years. So the French are occupied with the British. And so the theory is that the Brits have their hands full, right? They're dealing, keep in mind, this is while Wellington's in Spain, while Napoleon's in Russia, right? So, hey, what better time to fight the British than when? When everyone else is fighting. This is the Irish strategy. Always, like whenever Britain got in a war, Ireland would attack British stuff. You know, like they're trying to get their independence. So the critics of this war will make some major conclusions. First of all, Madison himself was reluctant to go to war here, right? Probably not good to lead your country in a war that you're not yourself convinced is a good idea. Yeah. Okay. Secondly, and really this is a greater conclusion, it's not wise to lead your nation to a divided nation. Either use propaganda, like Wilson, or we get attacked at Pearl Harbor. But it's not good to take your country into war when half the country doesn't really want to fight. Yeah. Right? Say it again?
United we stand divided.
Yeah, absolutely. And keep in mind, during the War of 1812, New Englanders are going to help the British. They're traitorous. Yeah, they're called blue light Federalists. They'll actually signal the Federalists. The Federalists will actually signal the British Navy if American ships are on the move and stuff. Yeah, I know, right? But to them, keep in mind, what's the first state to ever consider secession? No. New York. All right, New York. And then during this, Massachusetts considers secession. So the first groups to discuss secession in American history were Northern, interesting enough, because they thought that with these guys as president, they'd never get their way again. They wanted to quit and go home. Right? Now, here's a few things to recall about why this is a bad idea. We're going to fight a war that's going to depend to some degree on a navy, right? The British had 800 ships in the line. We had 12. So we might as well not have a navy.
We had 12 frigates. We didn't have any ships on
Oh, there are just frigates. Yeah, but we're going to build some super frigates by the end of the war. But you're right. Yeah.
We didn't have any battleships.
No battleships. Nothing equivalent to that, right? I don't know how many big ships the British had overall. America had the Jeffs. You're right. The little ships, that we had left over. By the way, this is going to be very unpopular. Ironically, Even old school Democrat Republicans are going to criticize this. Now, by now, Jefferson is old. He's not dead. Well, he dies an interesting day, right? But they don't want a draft. Well, what does that Madison implement? A draft. All right. Now, technically, a draft is not in the Constitution. It says Congress can raise armies. It doesn't say how Congress can raise armies. You understand? So, like, militias were the way so far. You know, Washington calls out the militias to put down the whiskey rebellion. Jefferson had called up the militias to deal with potentially a war with France, right? Or Britain. So we're going to see a draft during the War of 1812, the first time. And you're going to have both Federalists and some old DRs oppose it. It's going to barely pass, in other words. But perhaps most notably, particularly since it's Britain, we don't have any money, all right? So we're going to end up seeing what made a lot. Lots of paper money. Paper money, which is not backed by gold. It's a fiat currency. Okay? And it's just printed on the victory of America. Not. Our tariffs obviously aren't going to be very realistic when who's basically blockading America. Yeah, not going to be enough money in tariffs, right? Yeah. And sectionalism is going to be a problem. Okay? And I'm not going to do the war today because the military nature of War of 1812 is relatively brief. We'll save that for after your period testing. Okay, so I'm going to stop this for a second and then switch back to our question of the Constitution and Madison's interpretation. Of course, it's really funny when I think about when I even use the word Madison's interpretation of the Constitution. Why is that funny? Who's the father of the Constitution, y'all? Right. Like he's literally called that. And it's if anybody knows what the Constitution said, who would? James Madison. Right. So yeah. So it's interesting to me what happens here with Madison. All right. So Madison does go forward with military buildup. So is that consistent with our views? No. What has not worked? Well, it doesn't work. What didn't work? Peaceful coercion did not work. Embargo Act did not work. Non-intercourse didn't work. Macon's Bill didn't work. Yeah. I love leaders who are not solely committed to an ideology when it's what's important for our nation. George W. Bush presided over the housing collapse. Notice a bubble burst, right? His Secretary of the Treasury was a guy named Hank Paulson. Okay, Hank Paulson was a millionaire, a successful investor. And Paulson hated something called moral hazard. Does anybody know what moral hazard means? I am very reluctant to do it myself, ever. Moral hazard is when someone fails, you bail them out. You hear that? So, from a perspective of government and a Treasury Secretary, moral hazard is when a company, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs, investment banks, when they fail, well, what should happen? They should be bad. They should fail. They should fail. Like that's capitalism, creative destruction. If you invested poorly and you are a bad, business manager, what should happen to your business? It should die. It should die. The problem is, if those banks went down, which they started to, it would create a death spiral that would pull down the entire American economy, and it did. But at least what happened? You had this fella, Secretary of the Treasury, Federal Reserve, step in and inject cash into the banks to keep them from going under. Because if the banks went under, they would call in everybody else's mortgage. They would take everyone down kicking and screaming with them. So as much as Paulson hated moral hazard, which is bailing out companies that make that judgment, what's worse? The collapse of the American economy? Yeah, that's worse, right? So you can have principles. It's okay. You can have, but circumstances sometimes dictate that ideology doesn't work. And the belief of peaceful coercion works when you have the upper hand. But the British were not dependent on us. So we couldn't coerce them. We had no leverage. You know that term? President Trump likes to use that term, leverage. Like leverage buyout, like pressure. I have leverage, right? So without leverage. One of the things I will again say I respect about President Trump is he's used the federal leverage of current American power to get Middle Eastern countries to start recognizing Israel. That's awesome. You know, I don't mind us flexing on countries and saying, look, you need to do the right thing. You know, but that didn't work on Britain because Britain had bigger flex, right? So we have to be willing to accept that sometimes. So he starts preparing for war. But you see here, the war was unpopular amongst a lot of Americans. Old Jeffersonians didn't like it. They feel like it violated the spirit of warfare. You know, I mean, the spirit of peaceful coercion, right? Federalists didn't like it. And then a bill to draft troops was passed in 1814, strongly protested by the Federalists. Drafts are never popular. I mean, you guys probably can guess that. But at a draft, one time when people didn't even know if that was constitutional or not. So during the War of 1812, there is going to be a meeting in New England. It's a meeting in Connecticut called the Hartford Convention. It is a group of Federalists. By the way, the Federalists are now shrunk to nothing more than a regional party. So they have now taken up the mantle of states' rights because it's the strong centralized government in the hand of the opposition party. So they flipped, is what it seems to me. Like, they are now looking for term limits on the president, state limits, like you can't have back-to-back presidents from the same state and stuff. They even discuss what? Secession. Now, they don't vote in favor of it. Everybody hear that? They don't vote for secession, but they openly discuss it. And so had they gone forward with that, America would have broken off from the top instead of trying to do from the bottom, right? So this idea has been with us almost from the beginning, that if you don't like it, you can quit and go home. Lincoln says a hand cannot leave the body and exist as itself. You know, like we're all part of one thing. One nation, what word up there? Y'all pledge to it. Yeah, what's indivisible mean? Can't divide this thing, right? Republic. So this is interesting to me about the Hartford Convention. Again, it doesn't work. And they end up getting laughed out of Washington because when they get down there, we just won the biggest battle of the war. All right. And so we're in a position that the war is going to end not long after this with our getting a win. So they don't get it. Now, some domestic stuff about James Madison that I'm going to teach you now so that you'll have later for the BBQ. So Madison presides over 2 terms, dominated by the War of 1812, right? That's the most notable thing. His second term starts. But in many ways, there's some other things he does that are very interesting to me too. So in 1816, actually, excuse me, in 1814, the Bank of the United States charter expires. The bank was created by Alexander Hamilton in Congress for 20 years. So that every 20 years, what would Congress have to do? Recharter it, right? And so in the midst of the War of 1812, what did we not do? We had to recharter it. They went to recharter it, and what did Madison do? Oops, excuse me. He vetoed it. He vetoed, I'll lose it. He vetoes the Bank of the United States and calls it unconstitutional. All right? So they've kind of been like, okay, I remember when you had that argument the first time. All right? But then they pass it again 2 years later, and his Secretary of the Treasury, who had to be Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury, same one, Albert Gallatin, tells him, we have to have a central bank in America. Like this idea of all these separate little banks is not working. It didn't work. In fact, it's going to lead to an economic problem. Okay? So we need this, and so does Madison sign it. Does he change his mind? Yes. He had vetoed it, then later he passed it again, he signed it. He pushes a tariff through, and actually he doesn't push it, but he signs it. That is a high tariff. It's the first protective tariff in American history. So why would these guys favor a protective tariff? For a minute, Southerners like Randolph, like Clay and Calhoun supported it. Why? They thought that America would be able to benefit where they're like the South would get some businesses too. You understand? Like if we start tariffs to protect American businesses, more businesses will grow up in the South. The problem is businesses didn't want to locate where what was. There are plenty of businesses within blocks of each other. Where slavery was. It's just not good sound business policy. You understand? You've got to pay people to work, and there's nobody there available to work. Why? Because you realize that Danville is sort of like the Mexico of America, right? Like now, I mean, low income, high unemployment, low income, high crime rate. So my point, and I don't mean that to insult Mexico, I'm saying that you don't have to outsource a job anywhere. You just bring it to Danville. But we have lots of people who don't have jobs, right? In the South, the people were spread out all over the place. There weren't any major cities to speak of. And they're all like small yeoman farmers or hillbillies or large scale plantation, right? So they were open for some factory stuff to come down south. It didn't. All right. And in the end, it hurts the South. The tariff again makes prices what? Go up even higher, right? And then the last attempt to do something this guy John C. Calhoun is trying to be, well, he's trying to be president among other people, but he and his friend Henry Clay, they used to be friends, he and Clay are coming up with an idea called the American system. And I told you Hamilton already started the idea of it, but Clay and Calhoun are trying to say, hey, what does our country need? What do we really need? Abraham Lincoln's very first speech he ever gave was on canals. What's a canal?
Essentially a waterway.
It's a water road, right? What did America desperately need? Roads. We had no roads to speak of. If you owned a road in America, it was private. And I do mean you owned it, as in a turnpike. That's what they called roads. We had a turnpike here in Pennsylvania County that went from, well, the city of Danville, ultimately towards Franklin County. It's called Franklin Turnpike, right? So what a turnpike is at the end of the road, and the road would be paid for by private developers. They would have this big stick with like spikes on it. And you couldn't bring your wagon on it, or you couldn't get your horses on it because it was blocked, like a toll road. But if you would pay your toll, they would turn the big stick, otherwise known as a pike. So they would turn the pike, and you could do what? Go on their private road. All right. So they didn't have paved roads. They would put wood down, planks for roads. Right. So what John C. Calhoun wanted to do was take any bonus taxes from the tariff, right, or other taxes, and distribute it to the states to build what? Internal improvements are what? Infrastructure, right? Roads. So there's like the old word for infrastructure. Internal improvements are roads or canals. So Calhoun and Clay both want roads built in their states. Clay's from Kentucky, Calhoun from South Carolina. Clay's going to push another one of these road bills later. Madison vetoes it. He says it's unconstitutional. Because nowhere in the Constitution does it say the federal government's money should be distributed to the states. And state spending all the money within one state certainly sounds a lot like what? Yeah, some sort of favoritism, which he didn't agree with. So in other words, if you're going to build a road in your state, John C. Calhoun, then who has to pay for it? Your state. Your state can pay for it all you want. Go for it, South Carolina. So up in Pennsylvania, you're going to have the Lancaster Turnpike built in Pennsylvania. All right. There will be one road financed by the federal government, not under Madison here, and it's called the National Road. All right, or the Cumberland Road. And it will go from Cumberland, Maryland, all the way out to Ohio. All right, but that will be built later with federal money. And is it built in multiple states? So you're not going to get to spend federal tax money in your state for a road in your state. But today we're a long ways off different point of view. We have federal interstates, right? One of the largest spending programs ever in American history, built during President Eisenhower. So that's, again, Madison saying, well, I'm watching the Constitution strictly. What's interesting to me is, he vetoes this. And by the way, who has said this thing is legal by this point? I told you guys about the other day. John Marshall, the Supreme Court has ruled it constitutional. You understand? But he says it's not constitutional. And so what are presidents not vetoing bills for, by the way? Have you caught this? Jackson's going to change all this, but what are they vetoing stuff for? It's constitutionality. Jackson's going to veto it, guess what?
Anything disagrees with.
He doesn't like it. I don't agree with it. Veto. Right? Jackson's going to use more vetoes than all 6 presidents before him combined. Right? And you're right. He vetoes it if he doesn't agree with it. Not because it's constitutional or not, but because he's that strong of a president. You know, so much more of an authority as a president. So that's going to conclude these presidents. Jefferson, Madison. Hopefully you'll be able to make a whole lot of sense out of that. We'll do more of this chapter though. So I hope that you'll stick with the reading. Any questions from the folks scoring at home?